What's up, guys? Welcome to my first ever YouTube video. Let me give you a little bit of backstory of why we're here. I started making little posts on my Instagram stories, basically just speaking out against some weird things that have been going on. Most recently was this debate I saw on Twitter about 2 plus 2 equals 4. And I'm seeing PhDs in education, teachers, actually debating this idea. And I think we've all been seeing some weird things that in some way are tied to this growing movement. This will be part one of a long series. There's a lot to get into. And we're going to go on into some deeper topics in understanding what this woke thing actually is. And it's going to get heavy at some point. We are dealing with an idea, with a philosophy that started about 50 or 60 years ago. They've been echoing like mad, building new literature and books and references and peer-reviewed articles. And this has been going on for so long, it's a matter of time until we saw it spill out from the university. There's no better starting point than this book called White Fragility, which has been written by Robin DiAngelo, essentially a corporate consultant who goes around charging thousands and thousands of dollars, $20,000 for a 3-hour session to tell white people how they are all racists. And if I had to summarize the book, it deserves its own video to get into. White people are racists, and they essentially have two options. They can either admit that they are racists, or they can walk away from the conversation, thereby being fragile and racist at the same time. They're fragile because they cannot handle being accused of racism. Here are some things that prove that you're fragile and racist when you say these in opposition to being accused of racism. I know people of color. I marched in the 60s. You are judging me. You don't know me. You are generalizing. I disagree. The real oppression is class. I just said one little innocent thing. Some people find offense where there is none. You hurt my feelings. I can't say anything right. Here's a wonderful quote from White Fragility. I believe that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. I define a white progressive as any white person who thinks he or she is not racist or is less racist. White people raised in Western society are conditioned into a white supremacist worldview because it is the bedrock of our society and its institutions. This book is on the New York Times bestseller list. This woman makes millions of dollars a year going around to companies to do diversity trainings. And this is the philosophy that she is espousing. Book sales have been up, I think, 2,000% since the George Floyd murder and the ensuing protests. And I, in my own life, have received about 4 or 5 different communities or groups that I'm a part of recommending that we read this book in order to tackle racial oppression. Not everyone agrees. John McWhorter, who happens to be black, it shouldn't matter. He wrote an article called The Dehumanizing Condescension of White Fragility in Atlantic Magazine. I have learned that one of America's favorite advice books of the moment is actually a racist tract. She sees herself as the bearer of an exalted wisdom that these objectors fail to perceive, blinded by their inner racism. DiAngelo insinuates that when white women cry upon being called racist, black people are reminded of white women crying as they lied about being raped by black men eons ago. Another book going around, and these two books can be considered the twin Bibles. Many companies, I've heard alone from 25, 30 people, many companies are recommending that people read these books. These are the twin Bibles currently being held up as the ways that we can conquer racism. So this is a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. I've read it 3 times. Racist, one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inactions, or expressing a racist idea. Do Nothing Climate Policy is racist policy, since the predominantly non-white global South is being victimized by climate change more than the whiter global North, even as the whiter global North is contributing more to its acceleration. It's a simply false logical statement on its face. What it forces you to conclude is that if inaction on climate change is racist because it's going to affect the global north, a simple logical inversion of this type of worldview would lead you to believe that if climate change were to affect the global north more, then it would be anti-racist to do nothing about it because more white people will get hurt than people of color. It literally does not get better from here. Anti-racist policies cannot eliminate class racism without anti-capitalist policies. Anti-capitalism cannot eliminate class racism without anti-racism. To love capitalism is to end up loving racism. To love racism is to end up loving capitalism. The conjoined twins are two sides of the same destructive body. These are not deep books. They're very clearly saying what they mean. And all of these other institutions are inherently wrapped up in racism. And we need to dismantle all of them. Where does that lead to? White police officers and community members washed the feet of black faith leaders in North Carolina to express humility and love. This is not the only occurrence. There's many of these instances happening. There's other instances where white people have been flogging and whipping themselves during some of these protests, apologizing, getting on one knee and praying to black people for forgiveness. What is happening here, guys? People that never committed the crime or the act of owning slaves are apologizing to people who never were slaves. And to understand, if you come across this, which group do you fall into? Well, it's simple. Measure the melanin pigmentation in the layer of your skin, in your epidermis, and see which group you belong in. This is not a good idea. Christopher Rufo, he is a director of Discovery Institute Center on Wealth and Poverty, and he's an editor at City Journal. He writes, critical race theory is spreading rapidly through the federal government. Last week, a whistleblower sent me a trove of documents about a divisive diversity training at the Treasury Department. What I discovered is deeply disturbing. The training is called Difficult Conversations About Race and calls on white employees at Treasury, Federal Reserve, FDIC, CFPB, and NCUA to pledge allyship amid the George Floyd tragedy. The goal is explicit: to convert everyone in the federal government to anti-racism. The trainers set the ground rules. They claim that virtually all white people contribute to racism and insist that white employees must struggle to own their racism and accept their unconscious bias, white privilege, and white fragility. White employees must not fill the silence with their own thoughts and feelings. The trainers insist that whites hold fairly consistent narratives about race that don't support the dismantling of racist institutions. They claim the expressions "we should be more colorblind" and "we've made so much progress from the 60s" are in fact racist statements. Where does that come from? Employees are then asked to think obsessively about race throughout their daily lives. Whites don't get to decide when someone is being too emotional, too rash, or too mean, and cannot protest if a person of color responds to their oppression in a way they don't like. And if you have disagreement, you will be told that white silence has been one of the most powerful detractors from real progress in social justice, and that whites must sit in the discomfort of their own internalized racism and white supremacy. Who is leading this course? This man, Howard J. Ross, who has billed the federal government $5 million for diversity trainings over the past 15 years on topics including white supremacy, white privilege, and white fragility. In 2011 alone, Ross billed the General Services Administration $3 million for diversity training. And when you go through this training, what are you then told? You have to go home and talk to your kids. Talk to your children about race, because children become racist around 3 years old. This is from a New York City conference on teacher education over the summer. White supremacy culture, reading you off the list. Perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word. There's only one right way. Paternalism, either-or thinking, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, progress is better, bigger, more, objectivity, the right to be comfortable. This is a workbook For teachers, they're teaching that this is white supremacy. Here is a Washington State Teachers Conference shot that someone took of what they're teaching to educators that are now this fall going to go in and teach our students. If you conclude that outcome differences by demographic subgroup are a result of anything other than a broken system, that is by definition bigotry. Bigotry is a stand-in for racism, classism, sexism, etc. If you conclude, as is true, that French Americans make 70 cents on the dollar compared to Russian Americans, that's a broken system. That's bigotry. That's discrimination. If you conclude 95% of who the police shoot are male, that is a broken system, and that is bigotry. This draws you to make ridiculous, logical conclusions. This is what is now being taught in the school systems. The Smithsonian tweeted this out. Aspects and assumptions of white culture in the United States. Rugged individualism. The individual is the primary unit. The nuclear family. Emphasis on the scientific method. Objective, rational, linear thinking. Cause and effect relationships. Quantitative emphasis. Hard work is the key to success. Planning for the future, delayed gratification, following rigid time schedules, keeping orderly meetings, justice, protecting property and entitlements. All of these are aspects of white culture. So when you hear a black father telling his son to work hard in order to succeed, he has internalized the whiteness that society has bombarding us with as propaganda since we're born. Guys, I really have to speed this up. There's a lot to go over. The unintentional racism found in traffic signals. My friend is white and I'm not. She said to her daughter, "Remember, honey, we need to wait for the little white man so we can cross the street." And then the author goes on to say how we have sort of internalized obedience to the white man, right? So this is a reflection of whiteness. Not to say anything about those yellow street signs with black people walking on them. Architecture is systemically racist, so what is the profession going to do about it? After reading some of these, again, this is the tip of the iceberg. I decided to Google some random phrases and see what comes up. Knitting and racism. The knitting community is reckoning with racism. Surfing and racism. Is surfing plagued with a racist streak? Now's the time for surfers to prove we really are anti-racist. Segregated waves. Now surfing and the ocean are racist. Oregon state parks are now racist. The Oregon State Park in this article goes on to say, black people are underrepresented as visitors to state parks. They make up 2.2% of Oregon's population and 0.9% of daily visitors and 1.9% of overnight visitors to parks. We're seeing how these ideas are impacting in the real world. They've impacted countless numbers of people. I want to talk about also some of a lot of cancellations happening, a lot of vicious mobs, Twitter mobs, petitions being signed, people losing their jobs for very, very mild things. And again, anything I can get into in this video is the tip of the iceberg. 1991 Penn graduate accused of racism at Evergreen State College. At Penn, he fought against it. This is the story of Brett Weinstein from a couple years ago. He was an evolutionary biology professor at Evergreen State College, and they always had a tradition at that university. Black and other people of color, it was called a day of absence. They would refrain from going into the school on a particular day in order to demonstrate how vital they were to the university system. However, this particular year, in 2017, the students said, "We want white people to leave campus." And Brett said, this is fundamentally different than a voluntary day of absence. This is a compelled day of absence based on skin color, and I refuse to partake in it.
We want to dismantle anti-blackness campus-wide. We want to give some sense of solidarity and provide safety and outside for our classrooms.
Will you listen to me? Yeah. Okay. No, not maybe, please.
No, if you decide to.
Go!
Okay. I have arrived where I've arrived from a different route. I've arrived there through academic study. I know why racism happens.
We live racism. We don't have to study it to understand it. We live it.
And the issue is you think scientific proves everything. What about all the racist scientific theories they had about black people for so long? Explain that.
May I answer?
No.
It is not your
Listen. You're going to listen.
You asked me a question. I would like to answer.
Hey, hey!
Ho, ho!
Mobs showed up to his office. He was in fear for his life. Students chased him around campus. The local police department and the campus police told him, "We cannot protect you." And after everything that happened, even the faculty and administration would not support him. He later lost his job that summer. He's been on Joe Rogan a few times, if anyone wants to listen. Elite progressive listserv melts down over a bogus racism charge. Election data analyst David Shor tweeted about a new paper by Princeton professor Omar Wasaw showing that peaceful civil rights protests moved public opinion toward protesters, while violent protests had the opposite effect. The tweet violated a taboo in some left-wing quarters against criticizing violent protests and led within days to his firing by referencing research that showed that peaceful protests sway public opinion positively. This is some of the responses. For those of you who don't realize what makes the tweet problematic, try not to overanalyze the statistical validity of the research paper and think about the broader impact it will have if people perceive it to be true. Here is Benji Backer, an environmentalist. He says, "I just got canceled to speak at a climate change reform event because of a past tweet where I linked COVID-19 to the country of China. They claimed it was racially insensitive. Absurd." This is Stephen Sue, Michigan State Research VP. Stephen Sue resigns after pressure over research on intelligence. Progressive yoga studio, hoisted by their own petard, canceled for performative activism. Harrington's business presented a noticeable progressive slant towards social equality even before the frenzied and incoherent calls for racial justice took to the streets this summer. Kindness was already offering a controversial class for people of color in which white friends and allies were asked to respectfully refrain from attending. He's already segregating his yoga studios based on the color of your skin. What more did people want? Among the list of grievances by this person named Turner who complained was that while Kindness posted messages of solidarity with BLM on Instagram, their gesture was simply a show of performative activism. More than 800 people reached out, many asking to cancel their memberships after this social media campaign. Martin Parr quits as director of Bristol Photo Festival over Racism Row. Parr left his role at the Bristol Photo Festival after being criticized for his association with a book titled London by the Italian photographer Gian Butterini. Images in the book, which was first published in 1969, include a shot of a black woman placed opposite a photograph of a gorilla in a cage at London Zoo. Parr wrote an introduction to the 2017 version. He wrote an introduction to a book published 50 years ago. Cancelled. This is about Robert Larkins, fired from bank after confronting Filipino neighbor for writing BLM on his own house. Windsor principal on leave after Black Lives Matter stir controversy. She wrote, "While I understand the urgency to feel compelled to advocate for black lives, what about our fellow law enforcement? What about all others who advocate for and demand equality for all? Just because I don't walk around with a BLM sign should not mean I am a racist." Fired. Michaela Guido, president of the College Democrats of America, resigned after the organization's one black board member complained that she has not created an inclusive board, the New York Times reported. Barry Weiss, editor and writer for the New York Times opinion section, resigned, saying she was constructively discharged and, quote, "the subject of constant bullying by colleagues who disagree with my views." Gary Garros, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art's longtime chief curator, resigns amid staff uproar. In a widely shared Instagram post on the account, Change the Museum, an employee recounted that the senior curator, who is white, ended a presentation about new acquisitions by artists of color by saying, "Don't worry, we will still definitely continue to collect white artists." Cancelled. Andrew Sullivan, a columnist for New York Magazine, no longer employed there, as he explained in his final column, a critical mass of the staff and management at New York Magazine and Vox Media no longer want to associate with me. That's entirely their prerogative. They seem to believe, and this is increasingly the orthodoxy in mainstream media, that any writer not actively committed to critical theory in questions of race, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity is actively, physically harming coworkers merely by existing in the same virtual space. Critical theory, another name for wokeness. We're going to get into all of that down the road. This is from a few years ago. A feminist was banned from Twitter. She was banned from Twitter for not supporting transgender individuals and posting tweets saying, "Men aren't women." So there we have it. A whole slew of cancellations. I'm really bringing to you what is the tip of the iceberg. John McWhorter, who we spoke about earlier, he's compiled emails from hundreds and hundreds of colleagues and professors from other universities saying how they're scared to voice their opinions. And it's things like this whole cancel culture, that leads to an opinion piece in the New York Times called "Should We Cancel Aristotle?" They conclude by saying we should not cancel Aristotle. Thank you, Mr. Media, for not canceling one of the greatest thinkers of all time. But let me explain to you the subtext of this opinion piece. Canceling someone for mild disagreement or opposing viewpoints is not a bad thing. In fact, each case should be taken and examined on its own. Everyone's been seeing this, these cancellations, people in the press that have free-thinking opinions, mild disagreements with the woke left. And there was a push by Harper's to have this open letter signed by prominent people to say, hey, guys, free speech is important. The open debate and sharing of ideas is important. We have to be allowed to share our opinions. The letter was a few paragraphs, basically said, hey guys, Trump is really bad, but we need to be able to discuss, have intellectual debate as well. Harper's later said that they received tenfold more people expressing solidarity with the content of the letter, but were too fearful to sign it. They were too fearful to sign a basic statement saying, free speech equals good. This is Jennifer Boylan. She signed the letter. She later retracted. She said, I did not know who else had signed that letter. I thought I was endorsing a well-meaning, if vague, message against internet shaming. The consequences are mine to bear. I am so sorry. Let's talk a little bit about the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project was a New York Times magazine editorial or piece published week after week, various essays. This was written by Nicole Hannah-Jones. Is that America's founding should not be 1776, but rather 1619, the arrival of the first slaves. Her thesis is that the colonies went to war to defend slavery. This was widely criticized by historians. As soon as the 1619 Project was published, it faced criticism for a false historical narrative which was present at the center of its thesis. Historians included Gordon S. Wood and Victoria Bynum applauded the 1619 Project for what it was trying to do, but nevertheless condemned the thesis central to the essay. The letter disputes matters of verifiable fact that cannot be described as interpretation or framing. Leslie Harris, she wrote an article titled, I helped fact-check the 1619 Project, the Times ignored me. In the article published in March 2020, Harris states, I vigorously disputed the preservation of slavery claim. Although slavery was certainly an issue in the American Revolution, the protection of slavery was not one of the main reasons the colonies went to war. Despite my advice, the Times published the incorrect statement anyway. Nicole Hannah-Jones was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary in May 2020. More than this, the Pulitzer Center is now working in partnership with the 1619 Project in educational programming to engage students. Thus, an essay published by the New York Times, which got the central thesis of its opening essay wrong, has won a prestigious award and is being used to create curriculum for students. This is history education in 2020. Vast states are adding this to their curriculum for how to teach history. So that's where we are. I've tried to lay out a few odd things that have been happening. For every one of these incidents, there are hundreds more that I couldn't get to. And for all of those hundreds, there are thousands more of people that it didn't happen to because they're too afraid to speak out. What are some of the ideas here? Free speech is not allowed. Speaking out loud, voicing opinions, puts other people in physical danger. That's what they're saying. How did this happen in a climate, in an environment where we always said, free speech is a good thing? Where did this idea come from? Where did this idea come from that whiteness is everywhere? That everything, that every single way society works is whiteness. Now it's the 2 + 2 = 4 debate that first brought us to me making this video. Is it a completely different group of people debating about 2 + 2 = 4? Is it some of these same people? Is it the same underlying thinking? Who is it? Well, Nicole Hannah Jones was the one who got the debate started on Twitter about 2 + 2 = 4 because she asked for help because people were claiming that as a fact. And she believes there is no such thing as objectivity. Here's a bunch of past historical tweets going back past few years. No such thing as objectivity. There's no such thing as objectivity. This is also why the idea of objectivity is bullshit. There's no such thing as objectivity. The 1619 Project explicitly denies objectivity. So now there's a debate on math by a non-historian who published a history essay. Here is Rochelle Gutierrez, math education professor, community activist, frequent user of insubordination. Math education professor. And she wrote, yes, this is a part of what I've been referring to as defunding math. Literally defunding it from K through 12 curriculum, but also figuratively from our minds. Here's some other people, other educators talking about this. She's responding to someone who says, why do we teach math? What is the historical legacy of school math? And this person, Angela Torres, says, I want to do some investigating, but my guess is we were trying to separate people as to who was intelligent. White from black, men from women. That's why we've been teaching math this whole time. To separate people into different groups. Guys, all of this is really bizarre. It's really strange. But it's no longer strange for me. And once I was able to understand the underlying philosophy, the foundation, all these things started to make sense. It made sense why we're going around shutting down speech. It made sense why there's this debate over mathematics or science. If you believe everything has been completely tainted by a straight white male supremacist worldview, that literally everything has been constructed to perpetuate the dominance of those on top, including ideas like liberalism or mathematics or free speech or the idea of the individual. Of course we're going to want to tear those down because they're irredeemably corrupted by this power structure. So it makes sense once you dawn from the inside, you put on this worldview, this lens, this way of looking at the world, this framework. Of course you're going to want to do this. And of course you're going to want to shut down people's speech. If people are not unique individuals with their thoughts and feelings and experiences, but rather they're just mouthpieces for what they've been brainwashed and socialized to believe, of course you want to shut down their speech. They don't have anything unique to say. They are merely regurgitating this dominant power structure's ideas. Of course that's violence. Of course speech is violence. But that doesn't mesh with free speech. And to the extent that this worldview becomes more adopted and spreads, it's going to keep coming into conflict with nearly every other idea in society. That's why mathematics is under debate. That's why free speech is under debate, and we're seeing these things. And that's going to continue to happen. You can't believe that a person is innocent under the law innocent until proven guilty, and also believe that a whole demographic subgroup of people are involuntarily complicit and responsible for perpetuating some sort of tyrannical oppression in society. These are not views that can mesh together. They will come into conflict. A person with competing viewpoints becomes a schizophrenic person. A society with competing ideas will fall apart and become a schizophrenic society. I don't want us to become a schizophrenic society. We're going to go into a lot deeper where these ideas come from and how they've been formulated and perpetuated and spread. But one of the last things I want to leave you with, don't fall for an almost trivial or pedestrian critique of what I'm saying and say, I just want the status quo and I don't want anything to change. I'm a deeply progressive person. I want us to continue improving society. I want everyone that faces injustice to be able to live long and prosperous lives. And I want everyone who perpetrates injustice to be punished for that. I'm all for improving society, and I think we have a long way to go. Thank you, and hopefully part 2 will be up ASAP. Take care.